If you've ever felt as if life in a modern democracy doesn't seem all that democratic, well, that's because it isn't. From pedestrian-sounding issues like voter districting and campaign finance to lobbying, invisible primaries, and media manipulation, real life in a federal republic is a far cry from classical Athenian democracy. Sometimes the reasons are practical to cope with what would be the nonsense and chaos of a direct democracy populated by tens of millions of people or even more. Sometimes the cause is unavoidable. The good, the bad, and the ugly of global progress all moves too fast for a lethargic government to keep up. And sometimes the reason is greed, corruption, self-interest, infecting political systems that were designed to honor a high ideal, but didn't account for the messy little human bits. The United States of America is no exception. Whether we're talking about the Republicans on the right wing, the Democrats on the left, look past the larger-than-life candidates and the fiery campaigns, and America's vast political underbelly seems as if it could go on forever. But when it comes to the Democrats, there's one group in particular that's been a major player for years, but has only recently been thrust into the spotlight. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar law firm known as Paul Weiss, where not just a few dozen, but hundreds of Democratic lawmakers, candidates, and party operatives all got their start. It has been a bastion of liberal policy and thought for decades, and in the first months of the Trump administration, it's become a lightning rod for controversy from all sides. Now, before we get into the story of Paul Weiss today, let's briefly discuss the story of Paul Weiss at the time. First founded back in 1875, Paul Weiss has grown into a multinational law firm over the last 150 years, today boasting a fancy New York headquarters and offices in LA, DC, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and several other major cities across the globe. At present, it's home to well over 1,000 attorneys worldwide, with clients in big business, tech, entertainment, and more. Just to clear up any confusion, we've also got to be clear about one thing. When we say Paul Weiss, we're not just referring to a person's first and last name. Both Paul and Weiss are last names, and they're a shortening of the firm's actual name, which is Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, LLP. Bit of a mouthful, isn't it? So, for whatever it may be worth, rest assured that we won't be spending this whole episode picking on some Paul guy called Paul. We already have a Paul guy who we pick on constantly, and his name is Peter. Hello, Peter. Now, Paul Weiss is part of a larger echelon of legal firms in the United States and across the globe that are collectively referred to as Big Law. Those are the really massive law firms that dominate the legal landscape of major cities, usually with lawyers numbering in the high hundreds or low thousands, all of whom tend to be very comfortably compensated in exchange for absolutely ridiculous workload. These are the sorts of places where one helpful guide we found, Top 10 Tips for Surviving Your First Year in Big Law by the New York City Bar Association, advises new hires to develop a thick skin to deal with all the times that associates or partners will say that their work is and generally gives the impression that these young attorneys will be lucky if they find time to take a deep breath during their first several years of employment. Sounds fun. These high-powered firms are by nature very expensive to retain, and when corporate villains in movies or TV make reference to their armies of cutthroat lawyers for hire, it's firms like Paul Weiss that they're talking about. In 2023, America's top 100 law firms pulled in a combined $130 billion, and those numbers are only going up. Paul Weiss isn't even among the top 10 big law firms in the United States by revenue. Instead, it comes somewhere around number 15 in 2025, while firms like Kirkland and Latham compete for the top spot. But compared to the other fixtures of American big law, Paul Weiss distinguishes itself not because of its revenues alone, but because it takes a much more active and partisan role in American politics than many other firms of a smaller size. Here's how anti-monopoly expert Matt Stoller described big law, I'm quoting him. A network of law firms who serve as a shadow government for the out-of-power party. Stoller continues on, quoting again, "A key firm in this network is Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, a multi-billion-dollar entity that is so politically connected its New York office served as the unofficial campaign headquarters for Kamala Harris's campaign." By the way, that's referring to Harris's 2024 campaign after Joe Biden handed her the reins of the Democratic Party not her earlier than in 2019. Over the last several decades, Paul Weiss has become an epicenter for left-of-center American politics. Although we get deeper into the connections later on in this episode, suffice it to say that the firm appears on the resumes of two of America's three liberal Supreme Court judges, the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives and the brother of the Democratic leader in the Senate. They are a fixture of litigation to advance the Democrats' political causes. They appear frequently doing pro bono work that is in alignment with the values of the American left, and they also come out when it's time to play defense. fence and ensure that the nation's Republican Party can be stopped from advancing policies that Democrats oppose. But that doesn't mean that Paul Weiss is exclusively a gun for hire at the disposal of American leftists, and nor does it mean that the firm and its partners just go around advocating whatever legal stances happen to serve the Democrats' issue of the day. Instead, Paul Weiss exists at the intersection of generally left-leaning politics and profit. And in order to understand what that means, we can take a look at the firm's past clients and cases. On the one hand, the history of Paul Weiss intertwines many of the legal and political feats that the American left will call some of its greatest achievements. It's played a leading role across history in the fight to protect abortion and the fight to secure marriage rights and otherwise legally protect gay Americans. It represented the family of Anne Frank, fought for the legal principle, one person, one vote, exposed neglect to the abuse across America's nursing homes, and played a key role in investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. It started out as a key legal force in New York's Jewish community before eventually becoming the first big law firm to elevate women and black associates to its upper echelons. It saved the city of New York on multiple occasions, first from the Machiavellian and often racist machinations of Robert Moses, and then from the prospect of a complete financial collapse. It's represented the families of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. It's invested pro bono resources to reunify hundreds of migrant children who were separated from their families intentionally at the US border, and it was instrumental in taking down Roger Ailes, the highly controversial longtime chairman of Fox News. But at the same time, Paul Weiss has been a favored implement of massive multinational corporations, especially the ones that want to remain in the good graces of America's Democratic Party. For over 2 decades, Paul Weiss defended the energy conglomerate ExxonMobil in a human rights abuse case, alleging that Indonesian soldiers who ExxonMobil had hired had committed routine acts of murder, torture, and sexual violence against Indonesian villagers. They have a long and mutually beneficial relationship with the firm now known as Apollo Global Management, a gargantuan private equity firm that's alleged to have played a major role in gutting America's healthcare system through corporate consolidation. Its other clients include Blackstone, the world's largest alternative investment private equity firm, and the oft-confused other private equity firm BlackRock, which has faced intense criticism for its alleged roles in anti-competitive shadow banking and driving up housing and rental prices nationwide to unsustainable levels. Allegedly. Paul Weiss has fought on behalf of Google and Amazon to defend them from anti-monopoly regulators and trust-busting legal cases, while shielding Apple from all sorts of investigations and filings. Its website boasts of having facilitated nearly 1,000 mergers and acquisitions since 2020, overseeing deals worth over $260 billion in 2024 alone. So, when we discuss Paul Weiss as a group that has close links with American Democrats, it's not accurate to simply regard them as guns for hire in whatever cultural debate that America's right and left are fighting over on a given day. Instead, Paul Weiss has positioned itself as one of the most important and lucrative intersections in modern American politics, the place where America's Democratic Party and some of the world's largest corporations intersect. It's a place where the interests of liberals and the interests of lobbyists come together, and where Democrats and corporate interests can ensure that their objectives, their policies, and their theories of American governance are in alignment. And in the United States, where concerns are constantly growing that politicians on all sides are in the pocket of big business, Paul Weiss, allegedly, is where the magic happens. Now, at this point, we have to imagine at least some of our viewers are leaning to one side of America's political spectrum or the other. And sure, everybody agrees that lobbyists are bad and massive corporations are probably doing some shady shit on the side. But why is that worth making an entire video about, Simon? If the overall thesis is that some Democrats know some corporate lawyers, so what? But as we're going to explain, the connections between Paul Weiss and America's Democratic Party go far deeper than just rubbing elbows at the occasional fancy dinner. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Paul Weiss has played an outsized role in creating not just the Democratic Party, but the Democratic establishment, shaping its future leaders, providing some of its brightest minds, and serving as a conduit between Democrats and corporate interests, not just in theory, but in real time. So let's start with some of the most important current figures in Democratic politics, some of whom we've already mentioned. Those include 2 of the 3 liberal justices on America's Supreme Court, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. Both were summer associates at the firm, and Kagan, who did well during her time there, would quickly go on to take up positions clerking for some of the most important American jurists of the day. Sotomayor, by contrast, would describe her time at the firm as an underperformance and would have to move through work as an assistant district attorney and lower-profile litigation before working her way up. Hakeem Jeffries, minority leader of the House of Representatives, spent 6 years at Paul Weiss early in his career as a corporate lawyer, jump-starting a career that would see him represent Viacom and CBS before making a rapid impression in New York politics. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer didn't work at the firm himself, going into politics after school without ever having practiced law, but his brother Robert would serve as the chair of Paul Weiss's corporate department for 12 years and is now a key leader in mergers and acquisitions. Those four combined, Jeffries, Kagan, Schumer, and Sotomayor, are all among the most powerful and important Democrats in America right now as the party endures a stint in minority government. Look beyond the Democrats, who actually have some power in Washington right now, and the list of Paul Weiss alumni gets far longer. Recently deceased Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg got her own start at the firm as a young associate. So did many of the figures who surrounded Joe Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland. The last Democrat to serve as Attorney General before Garland, Obama appointee Loretta Lynch, now works as a key partner at Paul Weiss, representing BlackRock, McDonald's, and others. Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, J. Johnson, was a partner at the firm till June the 30th of this year. Paul Weiss alumni currently control critical state-level and federal judges' seats, and while it's not unusual for individual alumni to rise to nationwide prominence, the firm's former associates and partners fill an even more important role surrounding those prominent people. People with connections to Paul Weiss are very frequently drawn upon to serve as high-level advisors, aides, and staffers for political leaders, even when those leaders themselves don't have a history at the firm, and as a result, they control day-to-day functions of government, access to high-level political appointees, policy perspective, and a lot more. Of course, that isn't to say that Paul Weiss only provides political figures to the American left. Jared Kushner, son-in-law of Republican President Donald Trump, was an intern at the firm after he finished law school. But even Kushner only became a Republican in the mid-2010s, and back when he was at Paul Weiss, he was very much a Democrat while simultaneously working to expand his father's real estate empire. And with few other exceptions, the trajectory of Paul Weiss's lawyers and alumni who enter government is broadly the same. The vast majority end up working on behalf of the Democratic Party, and if any corner of Democratic politics is a hub for Paul Weiss, especially in the 2020s, then that would be the 2024 presidential campaign of Kamala Harris. Take Karen Dunn, a former Paul Weiss partner who's been a debate prep specialist for Obama and Clinton in years past. In 2024, Dunn was in charge of preparing Harris for a debate and scheduled follow-ons against Donald Trump at the very same time that she defended Google against the Biden administration in a major antitrust lawsuit. Dunn was expected to be Harris's White House counsel had Harris been elected, meaning that she would have followed in the footsteps of Josh Su, another Paul Weiss alum who was Harris's general counsel as a senator and vice president, directed national policy for her 2020 campaign, and was part of her intended transition team in 2024. Paul Weiss's chairman, Brad Karp, was a leading advocate for Harris in the legal world, pushing hundreds of high-profile corporate lawyers to throw their support behind her candidacy, and the two share a close relationship going back to Harris's time as California's Attorney General. Paul Weiss alumni played a critical role in getting Harris connected to Wall Street donors, where the legal field in particular ended up contributing massively to Harris's campaign's overall war chest of over $1 billion. The Harris campaign and its candidate had extensive connections to big law and big business outside Paul Weiss. Her husband is a high-profile corporate lawyer. Her brother-in-law is Uber's chief legal officer. Her top economic advisor was a former BlackRock strategist, and her fundraising coordinator is a corporate bankruptcy advisor, while key private equity and investment leaders played important roles in the campaign. But it was Paul Weiss employees that gave more to Democratic causes than any other firm in 2024, and where partners and associates were widely expected to fill out important roles in a future Harris administration if she had been elected to the presidency. Modern Democratic politics, and especially in what could have been a very corporate-friendly Harris administration, Paul Weiss seems to have ties everywhere. As the American legal publication The American Prospect explained about Harris's debate prepper and Google antitrust litigator Karen Dunn, to quote, Paul Weiss's partners, including Karen Dunn, were strapped up with personnel in the current Democratic administration. Dunn herself is married to Brian Netter, the now former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for federal programs at DOJ. She clerked for Attorney General Merrick Garland, who she helped prepare for confirmation as Attorney General in 2021. Garland even officiated Dunn's wedding. End quote. Indeed, all up and down Democratic politics, very few high-level officials are ever more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from Paul Weiss. Perhaps a given high-level Democrat didn't ever work for the firm directly, but a close relative did, or a spouse did, or their deputies did, or they cultivated close ties with Paul Weiss partners or associates through their own past careers with other law firms. While it would certainly be a bridge too far to say that Paul Weiss is some sort of grand puppeteer simply manipulating Democratic politicians as the firm sees fit, that's not the sort of role that we're talking about. Instead, its role in the party is that of the ultimate networking tool, a conduit for key ideas, personnel, and policy initiatives to pass from the private sector through to Democratic politics, and finally to the policymakers who will actually chart the course of a new administration. The firm doesn't have authority over the leaders of the Democratic Party, but it sure as hell has influence, and that influence network, with Paul Weiss at the center, seemed as if it might have been poised to play a bigger role than ever in a new Harris administration. By the time that Paul Weiss had tied itself to the Harris 2024 campaign, its role within, beside, and around the Democratic Party was always well established. But by that time, the firm was still not dealing with very much public scrutiny for its position. The focus of the 2024 campaign cycle was elsewhere, and other than the occasional profile of debate coordinator and Google legal defender extraordinaire Karen Dunn, the firm navigated 2024 while staying nearly entirely under the radar. But all that changed for Paul Weiss in the early hours of the morning on November 6, 2024, when the candidate that Paul Weiss's leaders and its personnel had so strongly backed was ultimately unable to defeat new President-elect Donald Trump. Although neither the firm's lawyers nor the American public knew it at the time, the early months of the second Trump administration would be marked by a series of reprisals targeting Trump's perceived enemies, not just within the federal government, but across big business, the legal profession, and private society. Paul Weiss wasn't the only law firm to be targeted by the White House. Another major firm, Washington, D.C.'s Covington and Burling, had lent many of its personnel to assist Jack Smith, a former independent special counsel who had been charged with overseeing criminal investigations against Trump during the time between his 2 terms. The firm Perkins Cole was targeted with an executive order that drastically reduced its access to the federal government after having acted as the legal representative of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. The firm Jenner & Block was targeted for its association with a prominent attorney who had been part of another special investigation into Trump, this one in regard to potential Russian interference in America's 2016 election. Several other firms would be targeted over the course of several months, all for reasons tied in with the basic claim that the firms in question had in some way stood against Trump in a way that Trump now sought to punish. But in the early days of the second Trump era, Paul Weiss distinguished itself in one historic but rather dubious way. While the firms that had been targeted before Paul Weiss chose to stand up to Washington in some way, either defending their prior work, launching countersuits, or both, Paul Weiss took a decidedly different tone. After years of taking a proactive legal stand against Trump and his policies, during and after his first administration, and decades playing the role of an ever closer confidant of the Democratic Party, Paul Weiss became the first major law firm to respond to Trump's threats with outright capitulation. The same firm that had, during Trump's first term, called lawyers to fight against the Trump White House en masse and defend the rule of law had now turned tail and run. After a short-lived attempt to try and ally with right-leaning law firms in a bipartisan rebuke of Trump's attacks, Paul Weiss chairman, Democratic fundraising powerhouse Brad Karp, journeyed out to the White House to cut a deal. The terms of the deal were ones that Trump would explain to the public personally. According to America's 47th president, Paul Weiss would pledge the equivalent of $40 million in pro bono legal services to be used on behalf of the White House and issues of Trump's choosing. The firm would discontinue its use of diversity, equality, and inclusion policies, better known as DEI, and it would publicly disavow lawyer Mark Pomerantz, who had worked as an attorney of counsel for the firm and had also been a part of an investigation into Trump's falsification of business records. The writer notes that there's no allegedly needed here because he was convicted. It's true. In an email, at least, he can pardon himself, can't he? So allegedly at the time, not allegedly at the time of writing, but maybe in the future? Check the date of publication, lies. In an email to all employees, the firm's chairman defended the deal by insisting that he had only, quote, reaffirmed the principles of Paul Weiss and taken steps to ensure that the firm could continue with the vast majority of its usual work rather than being waylaid by political threats that could compromise its broader objectives. But very quickly, signs emerged that Karp may have been played by the White House. A version of the agreement that Karp shared internally had made no mention of DEI policies or the attorney Mark Pomerantz, but both were referenced as key points of the deal that Trump publicly described. And if the leaders of the firm were surprised by the intense backlash that followed, well, then they might have been the only ones not to see that backlash coming. The American legal profession was stunned by the quickness with which Paul Weiss had capitulated to the Trump administration, not just backing down, but agreeing to terms that would see its resources put to use by the White House directly and accept White House control over its own internal practices and policies. Not only that, but by backing down, many within the profession believed that Paul Weiss, one of the most powerful firms in the country and one of the best suited to wage a legal war against the administration, had simply stood aside, leaving less powerful firms vulnerable to the same tactics of intimidation and executive threat. Any hope that the deal would stop Trump from going after other law firms was quickly dispelled. Several others have come under threat in the months since Paul Weiss's capitulation. And according to some insider reports, the vast majority of Paul Weiss's partners had allegedly agreed with the idea to make peace with Trump despite both the intense disagreement of so many lawyers outside Paul Weiss and the firm's long history of advocating against many of the same ideas and policies that the Trump administration proudly championed. The firm was on the receiving end of week after week of scorn and backlash, opposed forcefully by many within America's legal class for having betrayed the profession itself, and abandoned by many on the American left who could hardly recognize in Paul Weiss the law firm that they once knew. And worst of all for Paul Weiss, the decision to capitulate to Trump now seems as if it's backfired. A key part of the firm's rationale in striking a deal was the idea that clients would seek to protect themselves by dropping or otherwise not engaging with a firm that was publicly at odds with the White House. But now, with months to watch the ripple effects of Paul Weiss's decision, it now appears that the firm achieved the precise opposite result. Several major partners left the firm in the wake of the decision, including debate prepper Karen Dunn and former Homeland Security Secretary Jed Johnson. Other high-profile lawyers have followed suit, and some of them expect to start a new firm that'll take high-profile clients like Meta and Google along with them. Insiders have suggested that many of Paul Weiss's other clients have strongly considered finding new representation, disillusioned with the firm's willingness to give in during a tough legal battle, and concerned whether the same could happen if defending a client were to become inconvenient for the firm and its leaders, allegedly. At the same time, Paul Weiss has watched as each of the law firms that did choose to oppose Trump have each won when their day in court finally arrived. But the high-profile departures from Paul Weiss, as well as the decision of those particular clients to abandon the firm, suggest that the Paul Weiss that once existed as a meaningful political actor may be no more. For years now, the left-leaning elements of the firm have been forced to make room for an ever-growing contingent of corporate lawyers, driving up revenues massively as they take part in as many mergers, acquisitions, and legal defenses of big business as Wall Street could possibly ask for. The firm that was once a powerhouse player in left-leaning American politics had been going through a shift in its priorities long before Trump too came along. Now, the process of self-sorting appears to have only accelerated, with the liberal old guard incentivized to leave and the corporate-focused new blood being quite pleased to take over. In this particular space, a firm that's shown to be getting close with the White House is actually a good deal more valuable, especially when corporate mergers and acquisitions must be cleared by the federal government. And when it comes to new hires, Paul Weiss's capitulation and the departure of so many prominent left-leaning attorneys means that the firm will probably face far less interest from applicants who benefit from DEI policies. Fewer of those applicants means even more self-sorting by the firm, allowing it to handpick new lawyers in line with a more corporate-focused vision while leaving behind the partisan battles of the past. In some ways, the story of Paul Weiss is the story of a firm that has played a pivotal role within the American left. Its political involvement goes well beyond the scope of most of its peers, to the point that in the early half of the 2020s, it developed into a sort of thought leader on that side of the aisle. But the story of Paul Weiss, as written in 2025, is the story of a firm that was once a political force and has now chosen to pivot toward a very different series of goals. The influence network of Paul Weiss did dominate liberal politics, but at least right now, that appears to be history. Thank you for watching.